work in the tree or land sector myself. I work in risk management, but I must say, I mean, I work across a diversity of topics, but this one has given me much pleasure because trees, I feel, are so important. We couldn't survive without them. Um, so, just to go over section 4 and draw out a few of the key points, perhaps Simon could have the next slide, please. There it is. Okay, so what we have here is basically a philosophy. This philosophy is exceedingly widespread because if you look on the internet, you will find that if you type in tolerability of risk and search, you'll come up with this diagram in 10,000 different formats. It's used by numerous sectors all over the place. And I tell my students, if you haven't got a philosophy, you're heading for trouble. The reason for that is because having a philosophy allows you to be consistent in your decision making. So what this diagram basically shows is that as you move up the diagram, the triangle gets wider, and that represents an increasing level of risk. So at the top of the diagram, if you're managing a hazardous situation, you're at the top of the diagram because the risk level is high. The law requires you to do something about it right away. Don't mess about, get on with it, do something, because this level of risk is intolerable. If you lower down the diagram and the risk is not so serious, not of such magnitude, and by the way, I should say, when I'm talking about risk, I'm here talking about the risk of a fatality occurring during a specified time period, say a year. That's my definition of risk. So if the risk is low, then you move down into the tolerable region, or even if it's very low, into the broadly acceptable region. Now, it's worth pointing out that the statistics which have been compiled show that if you work in, say, if you actually work as an employee in forestry, your annual risk of dying, there we've got the table there, that's good. The annual risk of dying is 1 in 12,000 per year. That's pretty close to the top of this diagram, the unacceptable region. It's just inside it. On the other hand, workplace accidents as a whole are much safer than that. So forestry is a high risk industry comparatively. Workplace accidents, the risk of dying is 1 in 200,000. In terms of members of the public being killed by a falling tree or branch, the risk is 1 in 15 million per year. This is an incredibly small risk, and I have to say that most people who work in risk management wouldn't spend much time thinking about risks of that magnitude because they're so small and it just isn't worth their time to do that. So we're talking about an incredibly small risk. I mean, when we're talking about the risk of trees, that's the risk average over the country, of course, and not saying that individual trees don't pose a higher risk on occasion, they will do, but on average, it's very, very small. And that level of risk lies in the broadly acceptable region. What that signifies is that basically the control system which we have in this country for trees is pretty well okay because the level of risk is so small, we're managing it well. And it's unlikely that we'll be able to get the risk any lower than that, whatever we do. Now, in the intermediate region, which is the tolerable region, the law requires that you reduce the risk so far as reasonably practicable. That also applies in the broadly acceptable region. And what you have to do to make decisions, reasonable practicability depends upon looking at two things. One is what control well, what control measures you have. So you first of all, you say to yourself, well, how much will this control measure reduce the risk? And then secondly, what is the cost and difficulty of applying that control measure? Now, if the benefit, which is the reduction in risk, exceeds the cost and difficulty, then by law, you have to apply that control measure. And if it's the other way around, you may not have to. So that's broadly what the philosophy amounts to. It's common sense philosophy based on reasonable practicability. The HSE have made the point that in individual cases, if you have a dodgy tree, for example, reasonably practicable measures may still be required by law, which is obvious and fair enough. Now, this process, which I've described to you, and this philosophy, is what I would call a non-compensatory decision process. That's an important term because it sounds complicated, but it's very simple. It means that in deciding what you're going to do about some hazard, all you're doing is focusing purely on that hazard and the risk reduction potential for it. You are not thinking of anything else. You're purely focused upon that. Now, most decisions in life and most decisions about trees are what I would call compensatory decisions. I give you an example here. I don't need to introduce this beautiful tree to you, Sycamore Gap. Now, as with all trees, though, that tree at Sycamore Gap posed a risk to people. People would sit under it and have a picnic. They would walk under it, congregate around it. Obviously, it is capable and will or would have at some point shed branches, and so there was inevitably a risk of having that tree there. Now, as we know what happened to the tree, and it was removed at very low cost and with very little difficulty. So you could say, well, that was a reasonably practicable solution. We've avoided that risk. However, we all know the level of outrage which that generated. And it's quite clear that the public is not purely focused upon risk control. They care about other things besides. And Jim has told us about many of those things, and that's actually quite staggering to see the values, the numerical values put upon those benefits. It's overwhelming. So when you're thinking about managing trees, you need to take a compensatory decision process. And what you basically do is you look at the tree and you say, well, what are the benefits associated with this tree? And what are the risks of harm associated with it? And in the compensatory decision process, you do the logical thing. And the logical thing is, if the risks are greater than the benefits, you should apply some control measure. And if it's the other way around, you should not apply the control measure. And that would be in the interest of overall societal good to do that. So as I say, most decisions which are made by organizations and individuals are compensatory decisions. The decisions we make in our everyday life are like that. That's because life is complicated and there are multiple factors involved. This is my last slide. So the guidance I would give to anybody who's managing a hazard, whether it's a tree or something else, would be you really need, especially if you're a significant sized organization, I'm talking about individual householders here, but you should have a policy document which sets out your philosophy. And I've described the TOR philosophy to you, and I've talked about compensatory decision making. So those things would feature in that philosophy. And then you need to have a management system which is in accord with the philosophy. Obviously, it's got to be consistent. And the benefits of this are threefold, I would say. It protects people from unacceptable risks. I just point out that we're not providing total safety because the tolerability of risk philosophy does not require you to do that. It requires you just to reduce risks so far as reasonably practicable. The second benefit is that it protects trees from excessive maintenance or felling. And I think that's really important because most of the time we talk about protecting the public from trees, but I've come to think that actually we need also to be thinking about protecting trees from ourselves, from human beings. In fact, there's a feedback loop because we obviously depend on trees for our existence. The ecosystem would not survive without trees. And then finally, if you have a policy and a management system in place, and if you are enacting that management system, you've obviously got to do what you say, then you should be able to minimize the likelihood of you being held liable when inevitable incidents occur. Incidents will continue to occur, there's no question about that, but they will be few and far between, as we've seen from the statistics. So thank you very much.